North America is home to countless commuter railroads, both big and small, and beginning today in a 3-part series, I'm going to be ranking them based on a variety of categories, from usefulness to railfan appeal. Let's go. First off, let me explain how this works. I'll be ranking every North American commuter rail based on 4 categories, which are as follows. Frequency. This one's pretty straightforward. How often do trains run? Ideally, for commuter rail, you want to see trains every 20 minutes at peak times and every 40 minutes or so during off-peak times. In order for a railroad to earn a 10 in this category, this would be the standard. As you'll see though, not many US commuter railroads meet this benchmark quite yet. Usefulness. This category focuses more on a commuter railroad's routes and usability. In order to earn a 10, a railroad would effectively be able to replace owning a car, providing reliable and efficient transportation on a heavily traveled corridor. Modernity. This category both includes the current standard for the railroad in addition to its future plans for modernization. A perfect 10 would be an entirely electrified commuter rail with trains built in the last 10 years. Additionally, railroads can earn points in this category for having extensive plans to modernize in the near future or high-speed trains. Finally, the railfan category. How is this railroad for railfans? Generally, this category contradicts the modernity score to an extent, as railroads with old equipment tend to be more desirable to railfans. That being said, there are plenty of commuter rails with modern equipment that still earn points here due to scenic routes, interesting operational quirks, or anything else that would interest your average railfan. The final score will be tallied, and each railroad will be ranked on a tier list. In the case of any ties, I'll choose the railroad I believe earns the win in the final episode. Finally, to keep these videos from getting too long, I'll be leaving out mini commuter rails such as Tex Rail, Sprinter, and Arrow. Maybe I'll do a mini ranking in the future. Enough talk, let's begin. Today we'll be covering the Northeast, which is home to the highest concentration of commuter rail in the United States, so going in alphabetical order, we'll begin with CT Rail. CT Rail is a relatively new 2-line commuter rail that operates mostly within the state of Connecticut. Its 2 lines meet in New Haven, where one goes north to Springfield, Massachusetts, and one goes east to New London, Connecticut. Beginning with train frequency, I'll give CT Rail a 4. Being that it's such a new railroad, its schedule is a little lacking, especially on the Shoreline East. There's almost no midday service on some parts of the system, but based on its ridership, this makes sense. Moving on to its usefulness, I think CT Rail deserves a 6. It serves 2 pretty heavily traveled corridors within the state, and the fact that it gave Hartford, Connecticut a commuter rail in 2018 gives it slightly above average utility in my opinion. Additionally, trains run up to 80 miles per hour, which makes lines competitive with driving in terms of speed. If CT Rail added more trains to the schedules on both lines, and expanded Shoreline East to the Rhode Island border at Westerly, I think its usefulness score could increase to a 7 or even an 8. Next, for modernity, I'll give CT Rail a 7. Since 2022, it's switched to running entirely electric trains on Shoreline East, which is a huge plus. The Hartford line trains are still diesel-powered. Obviously, if the Hartford line was electrified, this would give it a higher score, but also if the Hartford line simply got newer locomotives and rail cars, it could earn an extra point. Still, thanks to its electrified Shoreline East, CT Rail is well above average in terms of modernity. Finally, for the railfan category, CT Rail earns an 8. While Shoreline East is a little boring to railfan thanks to its electric M8 trains, it makes up for this with stunning scenery along the Atlantic Ocean. The Hartford line is the exact opposite. Its trains use unique Brazilian Mafersa cars, and its vintage Genesis and GP40 locomotives are always fun to see. Unfortunately, however, the Hartford line is pretty boring in terms of scenery. This totals up to a 25 out of 40, in other words, B tier. Next up is Montreal's EXO. EXO includes 5 lines throughout the greater Montreal area, and despite its size, I rarely hear people talking about it, maybe for good reason. It's just so average. For frequency, EXO earns a 5. It's great if you're commuting from the suburbs to the city in the morning and coming back in the evening. Otherwise, it's almost useless, something that seems consistent among all Canadian commuter rails. Because of its great peak schedule and its terrible off-peak schedule, I think EXO is just about average in terms of frequency. That being said, EXO earns a 7 for usefulness. It serves a huge portion of the greater Montreal area, and despite its bad schedule, its high ridership seems to reflect its usefulness for commuters. In terms of modernity, I think EXO earns another 7. While at one point it operated a fully electrified line, it's now entirely diesel-based, but that's not all so bad. This electrified line was converted to the Montreal REM, which is one of the most modern rail rapid transit services in the continent. The rest of its lines and its trains are fairly modern, except for its older engines, which will soon be replaced by new Siemens Charger diesels. Finally, for the railfan category, I think EXO earns a 4. it's just slightly below average. Most of its trains are the same ALP-45s in multi-level cars, and railfans don't seem to be so fond of the new CRRC cars. Luckily, it earned some railfan points back for operating F-59 locomotives, some of the best looking diesels of all time in my opinion. In total, XO earns a 22 out of 40, average, in other words, C tier. Heading back to the greater New York area, let's take a look at the Long Island Railroad, the busiest commuter rail in North America. With an impressive 11 lines and 700 plus miles of track, this one's sure to be interesting. For frequency, I think the LIRR is an 8. Closer to New York City, train frequency is outstanding, effectively serving as rapid transit in Brooklyn and Queens. Further east, train frequency decreases, but this kind of makes sense as the population density also decreases. Obviously this means the LIRR can't earn a 10, but I think an 8 is pretty fair. In terms of usefulness, the LIRR also earns an 8. As I said, it's incredibly useful for commuters on the west end of the island, and can completely replace owning a car in certain areas. Once again, however, the further east you go, the less viable the Long Island Railroad becomes as a mode of transportation. The majority of the Long Island Railroad is electrified via third rail, so that's a huge plus in terms of modernity. It seems that the consistent theme, however, is that the further east you get on the LIRR, the worse it gets, with no electrification and eventually no signals even on the Ronkonkoma to Greenport line. For this reason, I think the LIRR earns a 7 for modernity. If they upgrade the tracks further east and replace the aging diesel trains and push-pull cars, this score could be increased further, but honestly, being a majority electrified system puts the Long Island Railroad higher up on the modernity score. Finally, the railfan score. The LIRR is fun to railfan on the diesel sections and pretty boring on the electrified sections. The EMUs are pretty repetitive, but the DE and DM30 diesels are very unique. I think a 5 makes the most sense for this category. This means that the LIRR earns a 28 out of 40, placing it squarely in the A tier. Next up is MARC, the Maryland Area Rail Commuter? That's a strange name. MARC serves the greater Washington, D.C. and Baltimore areas on 3 lines, one of which operates on the busy Amtrak Northeast Corridor. In terms of frequency, MARC is slightly above average, with its electrified Penn line having a pretty solid schedule, and its other 2 lines lacking somewhat. For this category, I think MARC earns a 6. Next up for usefulness, I think MARC deserves a 7. It serves 2 major cities on the southern end of the Northeast Corridor, as well as the more inland regions in Maryland. Additionally, some trains on the Penn line operate at speeds of up to 125 miles per hour, making it the fastest commuter rail in the country. In terms of modernity, MARC continues to stay above average with a 6. The majority of its trains use relatively new multi-level cars and new Siemens Charger engines. That being said, it loses some points for running mostly diesel trains under the wires. If they purchased new electric engines and started replacing older single-level railcars, this score could easily increase. MARC's elusive electric locomotives, however, are one of the sole reasons that it gets a railfan score of 7. The majority of its trains are pretty standard for a commuter rail, and its scenery is just okay. However, its small fleet of HHP8 electrics are not only some of the coolest looking locomotives around, but allow for trains to travel at 125 miles per hour. After spending an afternoon on the Penn line last year, it's hard to not give MARC a positive score. Overall, MARC earns a 26 out of 40, B tier. Next up, my home commuter rail, the MBTA. The MBTA commuter rail is an expansive system serving the greater Boston area with 12 lines, soon to be 13. I'll try to be as unbiased here as possible. For frequency, I think the T deserves a solid 6. Lines like the Providence, Worcester, and Lowell have pretty solid peak and off-peak frequencies, but certain lines like the Fitchburg and Old Colony are lacking quite a bit. In terms of usefulness, however, I think the MBTA is pretty decent, earning a 7. It serves basically the entire greater Boston area, in addition to providing efficient transportation to the city of Providence, Rhode Island. Though it can't entirely replace owning a car in the Boston area, it's pretty solid public transit. Where the MBTA is lacking quite a bit, however, is modernity. The MBTA's newest locomotives are coming up on 10 years old, and its oldest cars are coming up on 50. Additionally, it runs diesel locomotives on the fully electrified Providence line, which is not only one of its busiest lines, but what I would consider to be its most important. Because of this, I can't give the T anything better than a 4. Finally, for the railfan score, the MBTA earns a 7. It operates fan-favorite F40 and GP40 locomotives and has a unique fleet of work trains unmatched by any other commuter rail. I'm a little biased on this one, but the MBTA really is a fun railroad for railfans. Overall, this puts the MBTA in the C tier with a 24 out of 40. Moving along to a very similar commuter rail, we look at Metro North, the Long Island Railroad's sister railroad serving the Hudson Valley and western Connecticut. Metro North operates one of the biggest commuter rails by mileage, with a handful of very different lines, ranging from full diesel to third rail electrification and even overhead electrification. Because of how different each of its lines are, its frequency score is a 6. Some parts of the system, like the Hudson and New Haven lines, have outstanding train frequency, but certain branch lines in more obscure parts of the system have pretty abysmal schedules. In terms of usefulness, however, Metro North is an 8. This is mostly because it serves such a massive region. Metro North has one of the strongest regional rail networks, consistently providing transportation to the suburbs of New York City, ranging from west of the Hudson to deep into Connecticut. It really can't be understated how useful Metro North is for New York commuters. In terms of modernity, Metro North isn't too bad either, mostly thanks to its countless miles of electrification. Though some of its trains are getting pretty old, replacement engines are on the way, and most of its fleet of EMUs are pretty modern. What brings its score down a little bit, however, are the west of Hudson trains, which really could use a replacement. For modernity, Metro North earns a 6. Despite its countless boring EMUs, Metro North still has a high railfan rating. This is mostly due to its heritage units and scenic Hudson line earning it a 7. This gives Metro North a 27 out of 40 total score, placing it high in the B tier. Across the Hudson is Metro North's cousin, New Jersey Transit. NJ Transit operates a huge network across the state of New Jersey, with connections to both New York and Philadelphia's commuter rails. In terms of train frequency, like Metro North, NJ Transit is about average, earning a 5. While certain lines have train headways well above average, lines further away from the city become a lot less busy. In terms of usefulness, these less busy lines bring Transit's score down a bit, giving it a 6 in this category. While NJ Transit can definitely replace a car in certain areas, it's lacking in others, namely South Jersey. Though NJ Transit operates multiple fully electrified lines and has countless modern cars and locomotives, its modernity score is hindered slightly by its non-electrified lines. NJ Transit operates locomotives as old as 1965, which as far as I know are the oldest of any commuter rail. This docks the modernity score a few points, and with no immediate replacement on order, they'll continue to do so for quite some time. That being said, for the most part, NJ Transit is a modern electrified commuter rail, in other words a 7. Finally, for the railfan score, NJ Transit has one of the most diverse fleets of trains of any commuter rail, ranging from EMUs to modern electrics and vintage diesels. Additionally, it operates a large fleet of special and heritage units, and for this reason, it's an 8. Overall, NJ Transit isn't the perfect commuter rail, but it has some outstanding characteristics. 26 out of 40 in the B tier. Moving one state south of New Jersey Transit is SEPTA, the commuter rail of Philadelphia, which despite its large network is very consistently decent. In terms of frequency, it's pretty good in most areas, with acceptable on and off peak service, earning it a score of 7. There are definitely some lines that could improve, but for the most part, frequency is completely passable. Like its train frequency, SEPTA does well in the usefulness category, and this is both due to its large network serving the Philly suburbs and its unique S-Bahn design where trains loop around Center City. This earns SEPTA a staggering 8 in terms of usefulness, and with increased service, this could easily increase further. Next up is SEPTA's modernity score, which is a 7. Though its entire network is electrified, some of its trains are turning 50 this year, which is not the best. With a new order for EMUs, however, this could easily increase as well. Finally, for the railfan score, SEPTA earns a 5. Though I think it's great as a transit network, it's not as great for railfans. SEPTA's Silverliner EMUs can get a little boring to see over and over, and though some of its lines feature push-pull trains, they're few and far between. This still leaves SEPTA with a 27 out of 40 total score, placing it high in the B tier. Finally, the last commuter rail of this episode is Virginia Railway Express, a 2-line commuter rail operating south out of Washington, D.C. Being that VRE is one of the smaller commuter rails on this list, it doesn't really hold a candle to the heavy hitters like Metro North and NJ Transit. That being said, VRE is pretty decent in its own right, earning an average 5 in terms of frequency. VRE's peak schedule is pretty solid, and its off-peak headways aren't terrible either. Similarly, it earns a 6 for usefulness. It connects nearby Virginia suburbs to Washington, D.C., and despite it only being 2 lines, it consistently posts solid ridership numbers. In terms of modernity, VRE is just slightly below average. Its MP36 engines are getting kind of old, and its gallery cars are due to be replaced soon. Still, not the worst fleet in the world. 4. Finally, for the railfan score, VRE also earns a 4. It's just kind of boring. All of the trains are the same, and its scenery is just okay. Overall, VRE earns 19 out of 40. It's not great, but it's not the worst commuter rail either. High D tier. And that wraps up the first episode of ranking US commuter rails. We've covered the entire Northeast, and in the next episode we'll move on to the South and Midwest, before finishing with the West Coast and making final adjustments to the tier list. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a few weeks after this month on the railroad for the next episode.